But the great thing is that a lot of these studies that were misrepresented, you actually look back at the data and you find like, wow, look at that. No, actually higher cholesterol levels were associated with better health outcomes. So there's something that I was taught in medical school, and you know, the doctors out there, nurses, or other medical practitioners may have been taught this as well during their studies, was the Framingham study. And this is one of the cardinal studies in the cholesterol model of heart disease. And they followed like something like 76,000 people in Framingham, Massachusetts, for I think like 20 plus years, 20, 30 years. And they had all these different markers, all these different, you know, bloods and tests and this and that. And they were just trying to look for as much information as they could. It was a very large study, very wide, broad reach. And what I was taught in medical school was that higher LDL cholesterol equaled, and total cholesterol equaled, higher cardiac related deaths, right? So cardiovascular disease and deaths, so heart attacks and strokes, right? The problem with that is that the Framingham study actually showed the opposite. It showed that lower LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol conferred with, you know, equated to higher death from heart disease, from heart attacks and strokes, right? So it showed the opposite. So this person's asking, any long-term studies? Yeah, the Framingham study went for, I think, like 30 years, and it showed exactly that people with lower cholesterol died of heart attacks and strokes more. And in fact, that's what all the big studies that have been published in the last decade have shown, is that the higher your LDL cholesterol, the higher your LDL cholesterol is, the longer you live, the less likely you are to have dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. And the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the top cardiology journal in the world, published in 2020, massive literature review looking at all the best studies, all the randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses and all the big studies looking at saturated fat and its correlation with heart disease. And they found no association between increased levels of saturated fat and heart disease. None. And they said there is no reason to have any upper limit or recommendation on the maximum amount of saturated fat to eat. There is none. There is no safe upper limit. You can just eat however much saturated fat you want. There's tons of civilizations around the world that have no heart disease and yet eat extremely high saturated fat. Some from meat, some from coconuts, right? And Tokelau, they eat like just a buttload of coconuts and coconut oils and things like that. A lot of saturated fat. Maasai eat very heavily, fat and animal-based, meat and dairy. The Inuit just eat blubber, and when you're looking at people that are eating that way, you see very low levels of heart disease as well. There are some disingenuous studies with the Inuit looking at people that are of Inuit descent, but living in cities, eating, all the normal processed food, alcohol, cigarettes that everyone else is doing. And like, oh, look at that. They have rates of heart disease. Like, yeah, idiot. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about people that actually ate a traditional Inuit diet. And the Inuits actually, at this point, on average, start smoking at 8 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a big risk for heart disease, right? There's a well-known risk for heart disease. And yet, there was a study in 1993 that was looking at this and saying, hey, they have all these risks. They're just eating blubber. They're just eating tons of saturated fat. They start smoking very young. So there's a very high risk for heart disease. And yet they have much lower rates of heart disease across the population, right? So taking in the traditional and non-traditional eating Inuit, and they have much lower rates of heart disease than the rest of Canadians. And they're like, we wonder if this is genetic. So there's the 5 different markers that showed like your relative risk for developing heart disease. So maybe it would make you more risky or protect you from heart disease. So they thought must be genetic protection and specially adapted against this. And so they looked at their genetic markers and they found no, they actually genetically predisposed to get heart disease. They're more likely to get heart disease. They have all the genetic risk factors for heart disease, and yet they're getting at far lower rates. And they're like, okay, we don't know what's going on. We don't know if there's something else going on, or if these, genetic risk factors aren't really actually risk factors. And they just sort of hung up their thinking caps at that point, instead of thinking like, okay, well, maybe this whole idea of saturated fat being a problem was a bit crap. So yeah, LDL was never a problem. That was a complete lie. That is not an opinion. That is not up for a debate. That is a matter of historical record. That is in the published peer-reviewed literature. That is in the history books. That was fraud. LDL is not a problem. Saturated fat is not a problem. Next question.